My name is Rachel, I am 30 years old, and I make a living identifying structural weaknesses before they lead to a total collapse. As the head architect and risk manager for a premier firm in Seattle, I am trained to spot the tiny fractures in the foundation that everyone else ignores. I deal in cold, hard facts, load-bearing capacities, and ironclad contracts. I thought my life was a masterpiece of stability, built on a decade of sacrifice for the people I loved. But no amount of professional training prepared me for the 10-second voicemail that detonated my entire world on a Tuesday afternoon. It came in at exactly 2:47 p.m., sliding onto my screen right between a critical structural report for a $15 million waterfront complex and a cup of expensive coffee that had already gone stone cold. I tapped play, expecting a question about dinner or an update on a property. Instead, I heard my mother's voice. Elizabeth did not sound angry. She did not sound sad. She sounded flat and businesslike, as if she were merely notifying a tenant of an eviction or canceling a basic cable subscription. She said, "Rachel, we have reached a unanimous agreement. You are no longer part of this family. You are out of the business, and you are out of our lives.
Do not come back to the estate.
We are moving on without you." There was no explanation. There was no emotion. Just a verdict, delivered with the warmth of a morgue slab. For a heartbeat, I just stared at my phone, watching the seconds of the playback timer reset to 0. I could feel the blood rushing in my ears, the familiar thrum of a system about to fail. But then, the part of my brain that spends all day calculating survival scenarios and locking down assets quietly kicked in. If you received a 10-second voicemail telling you that you were being erased from the family you spent 10 years building, would you pick up the phone and beg for an explanation, or would you start burning their bridges before they even realized the match was lit? Drop a comment and let me know where you are listening from and what time it is for you right now. I would love to know who is part of our community. I stood in my glass-walled office, overlooking Elliott Bay, the sapphire water mimicking the cold clarity that was beginning to settle in my chest. Most people would have fallen apart. They would have driven to the family mansion, crying and pleading for a reason. But Elizabeth and Richard had forgotten one crucial detail when they decided to cut me out. They had forgotten that I was not just their daughter. I was the architect who had designed the very system they were now trying to use against me. I did not call back. I did not send a single desperate text asking why. I simply walked over to my desk, opened my encrypted laptop, and felt the first clean edge of the retaliation slide into place. I had been the silent investor in their version of family for far too long. Now it was time to conduct a full audit. I realized in that moment that our relationship had never been built on love. It had been a subscription service, and I had been the one footing the entire bill. My compassion had been a luxury. They had overdrafted for years. But the limit had been reached. This was not going to be a messy family drama. This was going to be an accounting. And by the time the sun set over the Seattle skyline, my parents were going to realize that when you fire the person who holds the keys to the vault, you should not be surprised when you find yourself locked outside in the cold. The silence that followed the voicemail was not empty. It was heavy, a physical weight that pressed against my temples as I sat in the center of my high-rise office. Outside the floor-to-ceiling glass, Seattle was doing what it did best, shrouding itself in a fine, persistent mist that turned the bay into a sheet of hammered pewter. I watched a lone ferry cut a white scar through the water, moving toward Bainbridge Island, and I felt a strange, icy synchronicity with it. I was moving away, too. I was severing the tether. I did not cry. I did not reach for the desk phone to scream at Elizabeth for her betrayal or at Richard for his cowardly silence. In my world, emotion is a structural flaw. It is the rod in the beam that causes the roof to cave in during a storm. I did not ask why they had done it because the why was irrelevant. The what was all that mattered. They had handed me a verdict of 0. They had decided that my decade of labor, my professional reputation, and my literal blood and sweat were worth a 10-second dismissal. I set my phone down on the mahogany desk and opened my laptop. The screen glowed with a soft, blue light, a digital sunrise that signaled the end of their era. Most people think of family as a collection of memories and blood ties. I had always viewed ours as a blueprint. I was the architect who had drafted every line of their success. I was the one who had taken a failing, mid-sized firm and transformed it into a regional powerhouse. I was the person who had engineered the complex legal and financial scaffolding that allowed them to live in a mansion they could not afford and drive cars that were leased in my name. I did not panic. I worked. My fingers moved across the keyboard with clinical precision, like a surgeon debriding a wound. First, I accessed the central server for our primary project, the Emerald Spine. This was a $15 million mixed-use development on the waterfront, the crown jewel of our firm's portfolio. My parents believed they owned it. They believed that because their names were on the letterhead, the intellectual property belonged to them. They were wrong. I had filed the copyright for every structural calculation, every aesthetic curve, and every technical specification under my personal holding company, long before I ever let them see the final drafts. I had built a backdoor encryption into the project files that was tied specifically to my biometric signature. With 4 clicks and a 24-character password, I initiated a total system lockout. On their end, the servers would still appear to be running. But the moment they tried to print a schematic, send a file to a contractor, or even open a high-resolution render for a client meeting, they would find nothing but an access denied screen. I was effectively holding the heart of their company in a digital cold storage unit. Without those files, the $15 million deal would collapse within 72 hours. Construction would halt. Penalties would begin to accrue at a rate of $10,000 a day. I leaned back, watching the progress bar reach 100%. This was not a breakdown. It was a balance sheet. I was simply reclaiming the assets I had invested into a venture that had turned hostile. My compassion for them had been a luxury, a high-interest loan they had defaulted on. Next, I turned my attention to the financial infrastructure. I had set up their retirement accounts 4 years ago, structured through a series of trusts and limited liability companies designed to minimize their tax exposure. It was a beautiful piece of financial engineering, a safety net that would have ensured they lived in luxury for the rest of their lives. But there was a clause, Section 8, Paragraph 4, that I had inserted as a failsafe. It stated that as the primary trustee and manager, I had the unilateral right to freeze all outgoing transfers in the event of a perceived risk to the integrity of the fund. Being told I was no longer part of the family certainly qualified as a risk to my integrity. I executed the freeze. Elizabeth's designer handbag fund, Richard's country club dues, the maintenance for their 4,000-square-foot estate, all of it was tied to these accounts. By tomorrow morning, their black titanium cards would be as useless as pieces of scrap plastic. I did not stop there. I called the lead real estate agent for the new Seattle complex. We were supposed to close on Friday. This was the deal that Nicole, my younger sister, had been bragging about on social media for weeks. She thought she was going to be the project lead on a $5 million expansion. "Sarah, it is Rachel," I said, my voice as level as a horizon line. "I am calling to give you formal, written notice. I am withdrawing my personal credit and my professional indemnity insurance from the Harborview deal, effective immediately. I am no longer a guarantor or a primary qualifier for the purchase." There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. Sarah knew exactly what that meant. Without my credit score and my professional standing, the bank would pull the financing within the hour. The deal would not just be delayed, it would be dead on arrival. "Rachel, are you sure?" Sarah whispered. "The earnest money, your parents will lose over $200,000. "I am sure," I replied. "Tell them it was a business decision. They should understand. They are very fond of those." I hung up. I rubbed my eyes, trying to find a flicker of regret, but there was only a deep, resonant clarity. I had been the load-bearing wall of this family for my entire adult life. They had decided to knock me down, to make room for an open-concept floor plan, managed by my incompetent sister. They were about to learn a very expensive lesson in physics. When you remove the only thing holding up the ceiling, the whole house comes down. As I closed my laptop, the first notification pinged on my phone. Then another. Then 5 in a row. The bank had started sending the alerts. The real estate agent had made the call. The lawyer was likely already staring at a blank screen. I did not answer a single one. I simply stood up, grabbed my coat, and walked out of the office. Inside, my laptop glowed with a different kind of sunrise, the kind made of facts, numbers, and the quiet, crushing weight of retribution. Every step I took on the wet pavement felt heavier than the last, not from exhaustion, but from the crushing weight of memory. For 10 years, I had been the invisible foundation of the Mitchell family estate, the load-bearing pillar that never complained, even as the structure above me began to groan, under the weight of its own vanity. I thought back to a decade ago, when I was only 20 years old, and still finding my feet in the world of blueprints and structural integrity. That was the year the family business almost became a footnote in history. My father, Richard, had made a series of disastrous bets on suburban developments that never broke ground, and my mother, Elizabeth, refused to scale back a lifestyle that required a small nation's gross domestic product to maintain. They were on the verge of losing the ancestral home, a sprawling Tudor-style mansion on the edge of the city that had been in the family for 3 generations. They had not come to me with a hug or a plea for guidance. They had come to me with a ledger of debts, totaling $1,500,000. I remember sitting at the massive oak dining table, the same table where they would later decide to erase me, and looking at the red ink that threatened to drown them. I did not hesitate. I put my name on the line. I signed for a bridge loan that tied my future to their failures, and for the next 3,650 days, I worked without a salary to pay off that debt. I was the person who navigated the foreclosures, the one who negotiated with the banks, and the one who sacrificed my entire 20s to ensure they could keep their high ceilings and their manicured gardens. While I was surviving on black coffee and the hum of fluorescent lights in the firm's basement, my younger sister, Nicole, was living a life made of filtered light and effortless joy. She spent those years drifting through the social scenes of Austin and Los Angeles, her life a series of high-end parties and luxury vacations, funded by the very firm I was killing myself to save. I would see her posts on social media, champagne breakfasts on yachts, designer labels I could never afford, and smiles that did not know the cost of a mortgage payment. There is a specific kind of psychological cage, designed for the strong child in a family like mine, a concept I have come to understand as the invisible chains of the survivor. It is a house with no bars, yet you never leave. For years, I stayed because I believed that my resilience was my role. I thought that if I could just carry enough of the weight, if I could just solve one more crisis or secure one more multi-million-dollar contract, I would eventually earn the right to be loved as a person, not just as a financial resource. I was trapped in the belief that my value was tied to my utility. I had become the family's high-limit credit card, and they had spent every cent of my loyalty without ever intending to pay back the principal. I remember one night, 3 years into the debt repayment, when the pipes in my tiny apartment burst because I could not afford the maintenance. I sat on the floor in the dark, soaking wet and shivering, while I checked Nicole's Instagram. She was at a 5-star resort in the Maldives, celebrating a self-care week that my parents had subsidized with money I had worked 18 hours a day to earn. I looked at the cracks in my ceiling and then at the gray water on my floor, and for the first time, I felt the structural integrity of my devotion begin to fail. But the invisible chains were strong. I told myself that survivors do not complain. I told myself that they needed me. The realization did not come as a lightning bolt. It came as a slow, cold erosion. I looked at the scars on my hands from late nights and the dark circles under my eyes that no amount of concealer could hide, and I realized I had seen a 0% return on investment for my soul. I was not a daughter to them. I was an automated teller machine that they had decided to decommission the moment they thought they found a newer model in Nicole. My compassion had been a luxury they had overdrafted for a decade, and today, The Bank of Rachel was officially closed for business. I stood at the edge of the harbor, watching the lights of the city shimmer in the black water. The $1,500,000 I had saved them was a drop in the ocean compared to what they were about to lose. I had built their skyline, and I knew exactly which bolt to pull to make the whole thing tilt. The gray hairs I had earned at 25, while Nicole was getting her highlights, were now the badges of a woman who knew exactly how to dismantle a dishonest legacy. In the world of architecture, we have a term for a structure that has been hollowed out by rot, but still looks perfect on the outside. We call it a facade. My family was a masterpiece of a facade, a beautiful, expensive lie that I had spent 10 years polishing. But the voicemail Elizabeth left me was the final stress test, and the Mitchell legacy had failed spectacularly. As I turned away from the water and headed toward my car, I felt the invisible chain snap. I was not a survivor anymore. I was the person holding the demolition permit. By Wednesday morning, the quiet of the night had been replaced by a different kind of noise, the digital hum of a professional execution. I sat in my home office, the blue light of my monitors reflecting in the glass of my untouched water, watching a LinkedIn notification pop up on my screen. It was a post from the official account of Mitchell Architecture, shared by my sister, Nicole. The caption was a masterpiece of performative concern. It said, "It is with a heavy heart that we share that our lead architect and dear sister, Rachel, is stepping down to focus on severe, personal, mental health struggles. The pressure of our recent growth has taken a toll, and we ask for privacy as she seeks the professional help she needs." I leaned back, a ghost of a smile touching my lips, as I read the comments. "Sending prayers," wrote one contractor. "So brave of the family to step in," said a rival firm owner. My sister had even included a photo of me from 6 months ago, tired, hunched over a drawing table, looking exactly like the unstable person she wanted the world to see. It was not just gossip, it was a strategic strike. By painting me as mentally unfit, they were attempting to invalidate my legal standing and my biometric locks on the Emerald Spine project. If I was overwhelmed, then my refusal to grant access could be characterized as a symptom of a breakdown, rather than a legitimate business decision. My mother, Elizabeth, was the first to comment on the post. "Her health is our only priority." Her sister, Nicole, as graciously agreed to step up as interim lead architect to ensure our clients are cared for during this difficult transition. Richard, the man who had watched me pay off his $1,500,000 debt, had liked the comment within seconds. I watched the hearts and support emojis pile up, feeling the cold weight of a realization I had spent years avoiding. This was the trap of normalizing cruelty. In a dysfunctional family system, there is often a designated black sheep, or scapegoat. My family did not punish me because I was weak, they punished me because I was the only one who was actually strong. By making me the unstable one, they could ignore the fact that their entire lifestyle was a parasite, feeding on my labor. My competence was a constant, silent reminder of their failures, and they hated me for it. They had normalized the idea that Rachel would always fix things, and now that I had stopped, they had to label me a villain to keep their own egos intact. I watched through the camera of my tablet as the industry news picked up the story. My phone buzzed with messages from extended family members, cousins I had not seen in years, all parroting the word overwhelmed. They were being recruited into Nicole's narrative, acting as the chorus to her lead vocal of betrayal. I could see the mechanism of a smear campaign working in real time. It is a slow burn, designed to isolate the victim, making them doubt their own reality until they finally crack. But Nicole had made a tactical error. She was a marketer, playing at being a strategist, while I was a risk manager who designed systems to withstand catastrophic failure. She thought the public lie would force me to come crawling back to prove my sanity by giving them the keys to the vault. She did not realize that in my world, once the structural integrity of a relationship is compromised beyond repair, you do not try to patch the cracks. You execute a controlled demolition. I did not reply to the post. I did not defend myself in the comments. I simply took a screenshot of every lie every public dismissal and every fraudulent claim of my mental instability and added it to the encrypted folder labeled System Audit. I watched my sister and parents perform their roles as the grieving, supportive family for an audience of strangers, knowing that every word they typed was another brick in the wall I was building between them and the $15 million they so desperately needed. Anger was not loud this time. It was clinical. They wanted a drama-free transition. They were about to get a total system blackout. Nicole wanted a story about a fragile woman. I was going to give her a reality about a bankrupt firm. My loyalty had been the interest-free capital they had traded on for years, and it was finally time to call in the principal. My compassion had been a luxury. They had overdrafted for a decade, and the collection notice was about to arrive at their front door. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I had memorized during the 3,650 days of my unpaid servitude. Evan Coleman. He was the Mitchell family's lead counsel, a man who had built his career on the technical legal foundations I had provided him. He answered on the third ring, his voice already strained and breathless. I knew he was sitting in his leather chair, probably staring at the same post I was, realizing the nightmare he was about to inherit. "Rachel," he said, sounding like a man standing on a crumbling ledge. "I have seen the post. I am sorry. Elizabeth and Nicole, they—" "Evan," I interrupted. My voice was as cold and unrelenting as a deep-sea current. "Save the sentiment for someone who still believes in it. I am sending an official encrypted email to your office in exactly 5 minutes. It contains a formal, notarized notice of withdrawal. I am pulling my personal guarantee and my professional indemnity insurance from the $1,500,000 line of credit that currently funds all active construction on the Emerald Spine project." The silence that followed was heavy enough to collapse a structural joist. Evan was a man of contracts, and he knew the numbers better than anyone except me. He knew that my personal standing, my high credit score, and my specific professional certifications were the only things the bank actually valued. Without my name as the primary guarantor, the bank's risk assessment algorithm would flag the Mitchell firm within the hour. The credit line would be frozen. The accounts would be empty. The life support for their vanity would be severed with a single click. "Rachel, you cannot do this," Evan whispered, his voice cracking with the realization of the impending disaster. "The firm has less than $200,000 in liquid cash. If the bank pulls that line of credit, the company will be in technical default by tomorrow morning. You're talking about a total collapse. You're talking about bankruptcy." "I am talking about a necessary risk management decision," I replied with clinical precision. "According to the official public statement from the firm, the lead architect is unstable and undergoing a severe mental health crisis. As the primary financial guarantor, I can no longer justify the liability of a firm managed by someone in such a state." Is that not the narrative my mother and sister just published to the entire Pacific Northwest? I could hear the frantic tapping of his pen on a desk. He was trapped between the lie they had told to blemish my name and the financial reality I was imposing on their bank accounts. He finally realized what they had spent 10 years ignoring, that the strong daughter was not just a worker, she was the entire structural integrity of the business. "File the papers immediately, Evan," I said, staring at the gray horizon. "Or I will go directly to the bank's board of directors and the state licensing board. You have 24 hours before the Mitchell legacy becomes a liquidation sale. Tell my mother she is finally getting what she wanted, a family moving on without me." I hung up and returned to my spreadsheet. I was not overwhelmed. I was just no longer invested. The subscription to my life was officially canceled. Inside my quiet office, the only sound was the hum of the city, a machine that moved on regardless of who was left behind. I felt a profound sense of peace. My parents had told me I was out. I was simply honoring their request with professional finality. The system audit did not take long. When you are the person who built the maze, you know exactly where the trapdoors are hidden. While the rest of the world was watching the public collapse of Mitchell architecture through their social media feeds, I was digging into the digital bedrock. I was no longer looking for an apology or a way back in. I was looking for the kill shot. I raked through every biometric log, every encrypted transfer, and every digital footprint left behind in the months leading up to that voicemail. My compassion had been a luxury. They had overdrafted for years, and now I was here to collect the debt. I found the anomaly at exactly 3:15 a.m. It was buried deep within the primary ledger of the Legacy Trust, established by my great-grandmother, Eleanor. This trust was the one asset I had sworn to protect at all costs, the heritage land in the Cascade Mountains that had been in our family for 4 generations. To my parents, it was a safety net. To me, it was our foundation. The records showed a massive, unauthorized withdrawal and a secondary pledge of the land title as collateral for a private loan. The total amount was $1,200,000. The recipient was not the firm or the family LLC. It was a shell company registered in Delaware, which had been used to purchase a luxury penthouse in downtown Seattle. The sole name on the deed was Nicole Mitchell. My breath hitched for only a second before the cold clarity returned. I opened the scanned digital copy of the authorization form. There it was, my signature, looping and precise. It looked identical to mine, but the metadata on the document told a different story. The digital timestamp proved the signature had been lifted and transposed from an old contract I had signed 3 years ago. Nicole had not just been lazy, she had been criminal. She had forged my signature to pawn our family's history for a glass box in the sky. My mother and father had either signed off on this, or were so blinded by their need to protect their fragile daughter that they had not bothered to check the math. This was no longer a family drama. This was a felony. This was identity theft, forgery, and grand larceny. The subscription to their version of family had not just been expensive, it had been fraudulent. I felt a strange sense of relief as I compiled the evidence into a single, lethal file. In my world, once the structural integrity of a joint venture is compromised by criminal fraud, the only responsible action is to dissolve the partnership and notify the authorities. I was no longer just an architect. I was the auditor of their destruction. I did not call the police immediately. I wanted them to see the structure fail in real time. I sent one final email to the group thread: Elizabeth, Richard, Nicole, and Evan Coleman. The subject line was Final Project Settlement, the Emerald Spine. I told them to meet me at the family estate at 6 p.m. tomorrow. I told them I would be bringing the results of my final audit. I spent the rest of the night printing the receipts. 142 pages of documentation that proved their unstable daughter was the only thing standing between them and a prison cell. This was not revenge, it was accounting. Calm, factual, and lethal. Inside my home office, the only light came from the glowing screen as I hit the final save. By the time the sun rose over the sound, I had the entire Mitchell legacy boxed up in a single manila folder, ready for the final demolition. I walked into the Tudor-style mansion at exactly 6 p.m., the heavy oak doors groaning, as if the house itself knew the foundation was hollowed out. The air inside smelled of expensive wax and the lingering scent of Elizabeth's perfume, lilac and vanity. They were all waiting in the grand drawing room. Elizabeth and Richard sat on the velvet sofa, like royalty facing a rebellion, while Nicole stood by the fireplace, her face a mask of practiced distress. Evan Coleman stood near the window, his eyes fixed on the manila folder in my hand, as if it were a live grenade. Nicole was the first to speak, her voice high and trembling. "How could you do this, Rachel? You have frozen the construction accounts, you have pulled the line of credit, and you have basically declared war on your own blood. Do you want us to lose everything just to satisfy your ego?" I did not answer her. I walked to the mahogany coffee table and set the folder down with a soft thud that seemed to echo through the entire estate. I looked at Elizabeth, who was dabbing her eyes with a silk handkerchief. "I did not declare war," I said, my voice as cold as a winter morning in the Cascades. "I performed an audit." I opened the folder and slid the first page toward Richard. $1,500,000 in debt that I spent 10 years paying off for you. I slid the next page toward Elizabeth. $30 million in liquid assets and $50 million in property that I personally managed while you treated my career like a quirky hobby. Finally, I pulled out the digital forensics report and placed it directly in front of Nicole. Her face went from a flush of anger to the gray of wet concrete. "This," I said, pointing to the forged signature on the mountain land title, "is a 15-year prison sentence." The silence that followed was absolute. Nicole's eyes darted to our parents, then back to the file. "I was trying to build something of my own," she whispered, the arrogance finally crumbling. "I thought if I had the penthouse, I would finally be as successful as you." I leaned forward, my shadow falling over her. "You do not build a legacy by stealing the foundation from under your family. You pawned great-grandmother Eleanor's land for a glass box in the sky." Elizabeth reached for the papers, her hands shaking. "Rachel, please. She is your sister. We can handle this privately. We can fix the documents." I stood up, adjusting the sleeves of my coat. "It is already handled. I have reached an agreement with Evan. Nicole has 60 minutes to sign the full confession and the quitclaim deed for the penthouse. If she does not, the police, who are currently waiting at the end of the driveway, will be invited in." Nicole let out a strangled sob and fell to her knees, reaching for my hand. "Please, Rachel, do not do this. I will do anything. We are family." I stepped back, avoiding her touch. "We share DNA, Nicole. Family is something you earn through loyalty and integrity. You outgrew that subscription a long time ago." As Nicole scribbled her name on the documents, through a blur of tears, I felt the final piece of the Mitchell legacy slide into place, not as a drama, but as a structure. I took the signed papers and handed them to Evan. "Sell the penthouse," I instructed. "Every cent of that $1,500,000 will go toward the establishment of the Eleanor Foundation. We will fund legal aid for architects and researchers who have been exploited by their own firms or their own families." This was not just about punishment, it was about planting a new seed. In the world of architecture, there is a concept I call the justice of the sower. You can either focus on punishing the rot of the past, or you can use the debris to fertilize a new future. By turning Nicole's theft into a foundation for others, I was making her betrayal the very thing that would ensure it never happened again. I walked out of the mansion for the last time, leaving behind the sobbing sister and the parents who had finally realized the cost of their favorite script. I drove back toward the Seattle skyline, watching the lights of the city begin to shimmer against the twilight. I opened my laptop one last time and pulled up the family risk file. I stared at the voicemail from Tuesday, the messages from Wednesday, and the signed confession from tonight. Then, I hit delete. That night, for the first time in 10 years, I slept through until morning. No guilt, no noise, no burden. I had rebuilt my own skyline, and this time, the foundation was ironclad. Thank you for following Rachel's journey. Please like and share if you believe that true justice is not about destroying what is broken, but about having the courage to build something beautiful from the ashes. Do not let anyone treat your worth like a basic subscription. You are the architect of your own life.